on our computer's desktop, and the first thing that we want to do is actually update After Effects so that it's running on the most current version. To do this, go to your Creative Cloud account and make sure that there's no new updates available for After Effects. If there is, it's always worth keeping up to date, just in order to make sure that you don't run into any problems that the new update has already solved. Now that you're up to date, let's open up After Effects. What you should be greeted with is the Start screen, where you can open up any previous projects that you've been working on or start a new one. We're going to be starting a new one of our own, so click New Project and you're off and running. From here, you're greeted with the After Effects interface, which, if you've used Premiere Pro before, should be at least a little bit familiar. But it might be overwhelming if you don't know what everything does and where it's located. So let's start off by looking at each of these panels. Up here we have the project window. This is where we keep all of our footage that we're working with, as well as any compositions that those clips are in. We'll get into compositions a little bit more later on, but for now, think of compositions like a sequence in Premiere Pro, a file that represents a grouping of media that you're working on. So to start with, let's bring in some clips so that we can see what a working project file looks like. Either double-click on the project window to choose clips, or just drag and drop them in from your computer. Great! Now let's take a look at the composition monitor. This is where you'll be able to view your work much like the source monitor and project monitor in Premiere Pro. Right now it doesn't show anything because our timeline is empty, but let's quickly double-click one of our pieces of footage and we can see that it shows us our footage. But you can see that it creates this new little tab here to view under. It says footage because we're viewing the individual piece of footage instead of what's on our timeline. There's a couple things here that you need to know. First is the size of your window. You can easily change this by scrolling up or down with your mouse wheel or touchpad to make your viewer bigger or smaller. Or you can use a specific percentage amount in the bottom left tab here. Choosing the fit option will automatically let After Effects decide the best size for your viewer. So for right now, let's go back to our composition by hitting the Composition tab to go back. So right now our composition window is showing us that we can either create a brand new composition or create a new one using a specific piece of footage as a starting point. I'm just going to create a new one by dragging our footage from the project window to the composition window. And there we go, our footage is now on our timeline. And as you can probably tell, our timeline is the box down here. It's basically functionally very similar to the one that's in Premiere Pro. Grab the playhead and you can see what's in your composition. And time passes as normal from left to right. And like you might imagine, pressing the spacebar will let you play your clips in real time. And over here we have the resolution tab. Right now it's set to full resolution, but if you're having trouble playing back your footage or having trouble playing back a composition later on, you can actually decrease the quality here so that the playback runs smoother. This won't change the quality of your overall project, and when you finally export it, it'll just change how you view it in the moment. So if we drop it down to half, or even 1/4, it'll be easier for After Effects to let us view our project in real time. But it's important to point out here that After Effects will always try to play your footage back in real time, but depending on your project, how elaborate it is, and the resolution you're trying to play back at, it may not actually succeed, and you may have to render it in order to actually view your project back in real time. And finally, this last panel here is our miscellaneous panel, which has a variety of tabs that we can use to impact our composition. Things like information about our footage, audio layouts, effects and presets, etc. And we'll get more into how to use all of these features in the next few videos. But for right now, we're just going to quickly go over two last sections. Here at the top left, you should see a variety of tools that you can use. Every time you click on a different tool, your mouse will take on a different function to work with your project. You have a simple selection tool, a hand tool for moving things around, a zoom tool, a rectangle tool, and a type tool, just to name a few. Later on, we'll go into some of these in great detail, but for right now, if you want to use a specific tool, you'll locate it up here, and if you hold your mouse over a particular one, you'll get its name and its shortcut key, so that you can access it really quickly. And finally, we have our workspace tabs over here at the far right. This is where you can choose from a different selection of ways that all these boxes can be organized. So you can see that the blue highlight here tells us that we're in the default setting, but we can also choose others like standard, minimal, and paint just to get a couple different layouts for different purposes. But we're going to stay with the default for now. But it's important to remember that even in the default, you can move around all these boxes to make your project layout your own. Make areas bigger or smaller by dragging the divides between each, or grab an entire tab and move it to a different location. Play around with these so that you can get comfortable knowing how to work with your interface. But don't worry about messing anything up, because if you do what I just did and move things around to a point where you say, "Ew, that looks really gross," you can really easily set it back to normal by going to Window, Workspaces, and Reset Default to Saved Layout. Now it's back to normal. Easy as that. And guys, that's just been a quick overview of the layout in After Effects. But before we move on to the next video, let's go ahead and hit Ctrl or Command S, or go to File, Save As, and save your project so that you don't lose any work. Let's make sure to place it somewhere that we can find it pretty easily. Putting it in its own folder is a really good idea. And title it something that will let us know instantly which project it is that we're looking at. Guys, I hope that helps you start feeling a little bit more comfortable about working inside of After Effects. In the next video, we're going to go in detail about how to work with video layers and compositions. I'll see you in the next video. So now we're going to take a look at how to work with layers. First of all, what is a layer? Well, you can think of a layer as this box right here. On the timeline in After Effects, each layer can only be occupied by one individual piece of media. So if we try to bring another clip down and place it beside this other one, we can only place it down either below or above it, but not beside it. And you can also tell by what's happened here that After Effects prioritizes seeing clips that are on top rather than the ones underneath. It's like it's looking from the top down. But why is After Effects set up this way? Well, it's primarily because After Effects is designed to work with creating an individual scene as opposed to an entire video unto itself. So the idea is that most of the time, whatever you're working with in each After Effects composition is coming together to create one unified result. If you want to move a layer up or down in After Effects, just click and grab it on the left side here, and then drag up or down to the position that you want. When you release it, it will end up in that new position. If you grab the end of the clip and drag it, it'll either lengthen or shorten. So if we want to reduce the length of this clip, we just click the end here and drag it backwards. Similarly, you can bring clips forwards and backwards in time by clicking and holding the clip somewhere in the middle and then moving it left or right. If you've used Premiere Pro before, this should be somewhat familiar. And you can see that when a layer comes to an end, it disappears and the layer beneath it is the new one that appears. Technically, this layer is still taking priority, but there's just nothing there to show, so the result is that we move to seeing the next layer. So that's pretty basic, but over here on the left-hand side, there's a few things that might seem a little bit different. Beside our layer here, we have a series of buttons, and we're going to look quickly and explore what each of them do to help you use layers better. Over here on the far left, you should see a little eye symbol. This symbol shows that the layer is visible, and if we click it so that it disappears, our layer will become invisible as well. This is really helpful for seeing what's underneath a layer without deleting it. Next, we can see a little audio icon. This just lets us know that our layer has audio attached to it and that it's audible. Clicking this will mute the layer, which you may find in After Effects is really helpful a lot of the time. Next, we have this little box here, which doesn't have anything in it, but we can see that the legend up here says that it has a little dot. What this is our option for soloing our layer. If you have a variety of other layers that are contributing to the final result of the video, but you just want to see what this one individual layer is doing, hitting the solo button will allow you to see what only this layer is doing and everything else will disappear. And finally, we have our locking icon. This allows you to lock your layer so that you can't make any changes to it. You can see that when we click it, it just flashes and doesn't really let us do anything with it. And even if we go into some details of the layer to try and make changes, we're not allowed to. This is great for any layers that you have that you just want to keep safe from accidentally making any adjustments to. Great! It's important to remember that the more video layers you end up working with, the more complicated things will get, and the more useful these tools will end up becoming. Another really helpful organization tool is just to simply name your layers. You'll notice that each of your layers are named specific things, but depending on whether or not you've named things before importing, it might be a little bit confusing. Renaming it can really help you to know at a glance where everything is. So I'm going to quickly rename this layer by right-clicking it and selecting Rename. Now you can type in the name that you want this layer to have. And lastly, let's take a look at what's called pre-composing. So right now you have an After Effects project with a composition that you're working on inside of it. But did you know that you can have multiple compositions within a composition? It might seem like a lot, but it's a very basic principle that gets used quite a lot inside of After Effects. So let me just open up another example here. We have a few layers here that are each contributing to our final image. and I want to group two of these layers together. This is what's called pre-composing, and if you're familiar with Premiere at all, then this process is essentially the same thing as nesting, but with a lot more flexibility. To group two or more layers by pre-composing, highlight the ones that you want to group together by holding Shift to keep your selection and then clicking multiple clips. Then right-click any of these selected clips and then choose Pre-compose. From here you can name your pre-comp whatever you want to. From here, when we click OK, we can see that our layers have been merged together to create a single layer. Not only that, but we can also dive into this pre-comp layer deeper by double-clicking it. Now we can see all of the layers within this separate composition on its own timeline. It's a timeline within a timeline. And if we want to go back to our main timeline, we can do that by clicking the Tab button. If you ever get confused, hitting the Tab button will bring up this little flowchart which shows your project compositions and how they connect to each other. This is showing us that our main composition is the one over here to the far left. And within this composition is another composition, which is this one here. As you start to get more compositions within more compositions, this chart will really be helpful. But for right now, let's just go back to our main composition by bringing up our flowchart with Tab and then clicking on this main composition. Now we're back, and we can continue editing our project. One of the ways that we're going to go over next is by accessing the options within our layers themselves. If we look here, we can see that there's this little triangle, and when we press it, there's an entirely new set of options available for us to start working with. And we're going to take a look at how to work with each of these properties in the next video. And guys, that's just been a brief overview of how to use layers within After Effects. Throughout the rest of this After Effects course, we're going to be suggesting videos that we've already created to help you go deeper into each individual topic. What we would suggest doing is finding these links in the description below, opening them up in a separate tab, and then coming back to them after you've finished this entire course. Like, for example, if you wanted to go into more detail about layers, check out this video that we have detailing about how to use layers and pre-comps better. But in our next video, we're going to be taking a look at making basic changes to our layers. We're going to be looking at transforming and animation. Thanks so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. So, how do you transform and make changes to your clips in After Effects? Well, we ended the last video by opening up this little drop down here on our layer by using this triangle. This opens up our transform properties that we can also drop down in a similar way. This is where you have the functionality to impact your clips with each of these different parameters. You can see we have anchor points, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Each of these has a particular function that you might be able to guess what each of them does. Position moves your clips in the X and Y axis directions. And you can make each of those changes by clicking and dragging left or right on any of these blue numbers here. The first one controls left-to-right movement, and the second one controls up and down motion. Scale makes your clips bigger or smaller. And not only can you click and move it to make it bigger and smaller, you can also input a specific number that you want to choose instead. But there's two numbers here that just do the same thing. Why? Well, you can see here that there's this little chain icon, and this means that your horizontal and vertical scale are linked together so that your clip keeps its proportion. If we unlink them, then we can scale vertical and horizontal size independently of each other. For now, we're just going to keep them linked though. Rotation here controls the degree to which your clip is rotated. 0 is resting normally, and 90 degrees turns it completely on its side. You can even keep going to rotate it a full 360 degrees. You can also see this number beforehand. This refers to the number of full rotations made by your clip. If it's not being animated, this number makes very little difference. But when we get to animating later on, this can play a vital role. And finally, opacity refers to the transparency of your clip. And right now you can see that when we bring transparency down to 0, our viewer shows white. If you're following along with your project, you'll likely see the background to be black because that's what the default is in After Effects. If you wanted to change it to be a different color, you can easily do that by going up to Composition, Composition Settings, and then down here you can change the color swatch of whatever your background will appear as. But that could get a little bit confusing. Say for example, if your composition has a solid background in it, but then you also have this neutral solid background to show transparency. So to show transparency better in our viewer, we can go down to this checkerboard icon here and click it. And now whenever there's nothing visible in the background, we can see a checkerboard design instead. Great! You may have also noticed that we skipped over anchor points. Basically, this just tells you where the center of your clip is located. Using anchor points and position at the same time can get a little bit confusing. But it can be helpful to just think about anchor points as changing where the center marker on your footage is. Changing the center point of your footage changes the axis around which your footage rotates. So normally rotating our footage would just look like this. But if we move the anchor point off center, then our footage now rotates around a different center point. The more extreme you push this, the less your footage will just rotate in place and will actually start to orbit a little bit more around a different center point. So now you know how to use the transform tools in your layer. But you can do all of those things with your mouse on the actual viewer up here too. With your selection tool highlighted by clicking it up here or hitting the V key, you can now click and drag your clip around and the topmost clip will be the one that you can control. While you're doing this, it's possible that you might make a mistake and want to bring everything back to normal. There's two ways that I'd suggest doing this. One is to hit Edit, Undo, or to use the shortcut key Control or Command Z. The other thing that you can do is notice what your changes are affecting in your transform options. As we move the position numbers are changing. And to bring it all back to normal, just hit this reset button at the top here. Keep in mind though that the reset button will reset all of these parameters, not just position. Now with it back to normal, try holding Shift while moving around your clip. You'll notice that your clip can move along only one axis. This will help you to make very isolated changes, in case, for example, you wanted to animate your clip moving to the right off screen, which is what we're going to learn how to do now. Bring your clip back to normal, and now let's place our playhead at the beginning of our timeline. Let's let it go for as long as we want the clip to last in this position. And then when we want our clip to move off screen, let's make what's called a keyframe. To make a keyframe, hit this stopwatch button beside the position icon. It's highlighted blue, which means that now any changes we make to position will be monitored, and the difference between them over time will be shown. So now let's move forward a bit, and make an additional keyframe by clicking this new diamond icon here. To go back and forth between your two keyframes, hit either of these forward or backward arrows here. So right now we don't see our clip changing at all yet. This is because the keyframes say exactly the same thing. But now let's go to the second keyframe and move the position over to the right. A quick little note, if you're using these blue numbers here to scroll, holding Shift while making any changes will make it more sensitive, and holding either Control or Command while making these changes will make it very subtle. Try it out for yourself. Great, but now let's move it so that it goes all the way off screen to the right. Now if we go back to this first keyframe and hit the spacebar to play, we can see that we just animated our clip to move over to the right. Guys, that looks great, but we can see that the movement is kind of slow and mechanical. We want it to feel a little bit more fluid. So I'm going to show you a couple methods that I would prefer to use. To start, let's go to the keyframes here, and let's hit the plus button on our keyboard to zoom in more on our timeline. If we move the keyframes closer together, this will make the change happen the same amount, but over a shorter period of time. So the result is that the animation will appear faster. It's getting better, but to make it more fluid, we want to do something called adding a bezier. Right-click on the first keyframe here and select Keyframe Assist. Then we're going to go here and choose an option called Easy Ease. Now we can see that our diamond keyframe changed shape to look more like an hourglass. What this is called a bezier, and it lets us know that our animation of this clip is no longer linear, it's non-linear, meaning that it's changing a different amount each frame over time. Here's what that looks like. It starts slow, and then it gets faster as it goes along. It's like it's accelerating. The reason a lot of people think it looks better is because it looks more realistic. Because in real life, normal things don't just reach their top speed instantaneously. Think of a car that starts moving again after the light turns green. It doesn't just go to top speed right away, it needs to accelerate a little bit. But guys, you've just successfully made an awesome looking animation for your clip. You can do the same thing with all of these parameters that are on this list: scale, rotation, and even opacity to fade in or out your clip. But there's one last thing that I'm going to introduce you to without teaching, so that you can see how much more there is that you can actually do within this program. If you click on a particular parameter that you're making changes to, and then hit this little graph icon here, you can see the animation changes over time on a graph. From here, you can make even more specific changes and really dial in the specific look that you want your animation to have. But this is a really advanced feature that you can come back to after you've finished this course. So to get out of the graph view, just hit the graph icon again. I hope you found this video on animations really helpful. In the next video, we're going to go over how to use layer masks. It's a really essential tool inside of After Effects. Thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next video. So let's learn how to do some masking. First question is, what is masking? Well, that's the process of telling After Effects to select a particular portion of that layer that you're working on. In order to create a mask, go to the rectangle tool up here, or use the shortcut key Q. Then your cursor should look like a crosshair. Make sure the video layer you want to mask is highlighted. Now, whenever you click and drag on the viewer, you should see After Effects telling that anything inside of the shape is something that you want to keep, and anything outside of the shape is something that you don't want to see. It's like making a cutout of your video. So now we've selected that we want this portion of the clip and that everything else should be transparent. But even after we've selected our mask, we can make some changes to the mask. We can go down here to our dropdown, and we can see that now, in addition to having the transform and audio options, we also have a new dropdown called masks. Hit the triangle and then hit the next one, and we can see that we have some properties that we can use to influence specific aspects of the mask. Mask path, mask feather, mask opacity, and mask expansion. Let's quickly explore each of these. The mask path simply refers to the location of the mask and allows you to animate it, using the keyframe stopwatch like we did in the other example for animating our video off to the right of screen. If we make a new keyframe and then move forwards and change the position of the mask, we can see that it animates in that direction. Next up is mask feather, and this one will be used very often throughout your After Effects career. What this basically does is gradually fades the edges of what we've chosen and what's not, so that it's more of a gradient instead of just a harsh edge. Mask opacity simply refers to the opacity of whatever is inside the mask. And finally, mask expansion allows you to make the mask area smaller or bigger after the fact. But why would you want to change the mask size instead of just drawing a new outline? Well, maybe you've already animated it and done a lot of work with the mask, and then you go to feather it and you realize that it's a little too small of a selection, but you don't want to go back and do all that work again. So this allows you to keep your work, but make a secondary change to help make it perfect. Great, but there's one last thing that we want to make mention of. Masks can select for what's inside them, but they can also select for what's outside of them. If we go to the top of the mask section, we can see that there's a checkbox called invert. If we select it, then we can see that our mask is now inverted so that the inside is transparent and the outside is visible. You can also do something similar by changing its action to subtract instead of add. There's also a variety of other blending options that you'll likely use far less often, but you can still play around with them if you want to see what they do. Lastly, you can turn off the mask by selecting the None option here. This keeps all of the work that you've done with the mask, but just makes it inactive for the moment. But you don't just have to use the rectangle shape to mask with. If we go back up here to the rectangle tool and click and hold it, we can see that we have a bunch of different tools that we can use to select from. We have an ellipse tool. We even have a polygon tool, where when you stretch it out and hold it, then you can choose the number of sides you want that shape to have by holding it and then either hitting the up or down arrow keys to give it either less or more points. But beside that, we have this pen tool. This tool allows us to create a mask that's completely pre-drawn and can be any shape you can possibly think of. Click it in order to start using it, or hit the shortcut key G. You can really make anything, even a really weird shape. To do this, highlight your layer, and then every time that you click on the viewer, you'll make a new point. And then every time you make another click, that point will connect to the previous one. Keep this going until you create a full shape and then connect the last point to the first. You might be wondering, why would you ever want to make such a weird shape instead of a perfect geometric one? Well, one reason is if you want to rotoscope a person and track their movements over time. If you're interested, we already have a video where we went over that entire process of rotoscoping in detail and how to do it most effectively. But as we're playing around, you might have noticed that if you don't have your layer highlighted, and then you start to use any of your mask tools, you'll actually be creating an entirely new layer called a shape layer. What this does is create an entire new layer of just a solid color. And your selection chooses the shape of that solid color. So, for example, if you just wanted to make a simple red rectangle, you would make sure that nothing is highlighted, and then click and drag to make your rectangle. And then in order to change its color, you would go up here and click the color swatch and make your color selection manually. But your shape doesn't just have to be a solid color. If you go up here to the fill option and click the word fill, you can see other options for giving your shape a linear or a radial gradient. You can also make it transparent by just clicking this button here, and that might seem kind of useless until you go up here to the top and increase the stroke. Now your shape is just an outline that can be seen through. But now that you have a shape layer and you've stylized it a little, there are so many other things that you can do to give life to it. One of the best ways to go about doing this is by going down to your shape layer and hitting this little button here that says Add. This will pop up a whole list of things that you can add to your shape layer to give it additional characteristics or even animation. We're going to be quickly going over an example with a feature that you may use a lot in the future: trim paths. To select it, just click it. And I'm just going to quickly re-add the stroke on the outside of our shape layer and make the rest of the fill transparent in preparation for what we're going to be showing you. If you go here to the trim path dropdown and move either the start or end parameters, you can see that our stroke looks like it's being drawn on or off. And you can keyframe effects like this so that it happens over time. But not only that, you can get creative by, for example, changing the start and end parameters at the same time so that they show only a small portion of the border at once. Then you can keyframe the offset parameter so that your border segment makes a full circuit around your shape. If you plan on working at all with motion graphics in the future, you can probably see how this would be a really cool feature. Feel free to play around with all the different parameters from the add section to get a feeling for what they all do. We are almost done now, but we're just going to quickly reset our shape layer and then drag it over our subject to show you one last feature: track mats. Track mats are basically a layer that, when used, is invisible on its own, but it controls the opacity of another layer. Let me quickly show you what I mean. So we have our rectangle here over our subject, but when we go down to our track mat section of the layer footage of our woman and choose the alpha mat of our shape layer, we can see that only what's inside of that rectangle is now able to be seen. It's almost acting like a target of what you can see of the clip beneath it. Cool, right? You can also choose the inverted mat if you want to show everything outside of your shape. And the lumen mat works pretty much the same way, just using luminance from the shape layer to control how transparent our clip is. So we can see right now that our footage is semi-transparent. And if we change the color of our shape layer to something more white, our clip is fully present. And if we get closer to black, our clip gets more transparent. Using all of the features we covered in this tutorial will help you to have a more holistic understanding of masking in After Effects. And it'll help you to be more prepared for the next challenge you face trying to create your own After Effects projects. But guys, that's it for this one. I hope you feel a little bit more comfortable masking in After Effects. In our next video, we're going to go over how to create and work with simple text. Thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see a new text layer to our project. You can go about it a variety of ways, but the easiest would be to either go to Layer, New, Text, or to bring up the Type tool with Control or Command T. Now click anywhere on your footage to indicate where you want your text to roughly be placed. You should see a little line here indicating the rough size of your text, and now whenever you type on your keyboard, it appears right away on your screen. Great! You just created text inside of After Effects, but I really doubt that's all you wanted to do with it. So we're going to go over the basics of how to actually work with your text, and then some more intermediate ways that you can stylize it and make it work best for you. To start with, let's change the font. Right now we've got a pretty generic font, and I want something that looks a lot nicer. To choose your new font, let's highlight our text, and then go up to our Character tab, and then select a new font. You can also see a really quick example of what that font is going to look like on this side of the dropdown. I'm going to choose this font called Bebes New, but you can choose whatever font you prefer. Uh-oh, except we just hit a problem. Only half of our text is actually recognizing the font change. That's because we only highlighted half of our text. Changes that you make to text in After Effects will only take effect on whatever's highlighted. So to change all of our text, we need to highlight all of our text. Now, let's choose the font again, and now the font has been recognized by all of our text. Great. Right beneath that, we can see the options for styling this particular font: bold or thin, and some fonts even have a specific italic option. To the right, we can see two color swatches. This top left one here controls your text color. So let's highlight the text and choose the new color. That looks great. Right below that is the font size parameter. Again, make sure that all of your font is highlighted because it will only impact whatever's highlighted. You can drag the blue number here left or right to make it smaller or bigger. Or you can just input a specific number. Next, beside that is leading. Yes, it's actually called leading and not leading, as I found out recently. And this controls, if you have multiple lines of text, the vertical spacing between those lines. Below that, we have kerning and tracking. Kerning will control the space between individual characters, while tracking will help you to control the spread of the entirety of your selected text. Below that, we have the stroke amount. This controls how many pixels wide the outer stroke of your text will be. Keeping it at 0 will make sure that your text does not have a stroke. To actually give your text a stroke, just increase this value to anything above 0. And if you want to change the color of your stroke, you can control it with this second swatch up here. And then you can even choose which color appears over which, either the fill above the stroke or the stroke above the fill. It's a simple stylistic choice. Next, quickly here, you can control the vertical or horizontal scaling individually if you'd like. As well, you can shift the baseline of where your text is located either up or down. And finally, here you can control the Mesome, which basically allows you to proportionally move your text closer together based on the individual characters and how much space they take up. So, for example, you can see that the M and the O here are packed closely together, but the O only goes as far as the top edge of the T, leaving room at the bottom here where there's a lot more space. And the Y down here shows it even more, because there's technically a border that the Mesome is recognizing right about here. And lastly here we have paragraph styles, where you can easily configure your text to be set to the left, center, or right. But those are all of the most common parameters that you'll likely run into as you begin to learn After Effects. But now that we know how to give our text a basic look, how do we actually give it more unique characteristics and even some animation? Well, like in the last video on masking with the add section, a great place to start for your text layer is under here with this tab called Animate. Click it and you should be shown a list of animation parameters that you can give to your text. Most of them should be pretty self-explanatory, but feel free to experiment with any of them so that you can see exactly what they do. Like, for example, we can add a skew effect, and we can use this to animate your text to skew off angle over time. There's a lot of really simple and powerful effects that you can give your text just from this menu alone. And lastly, now that we know a little bit more about how to work with our text, we want to go over one very common way you can give your text a professional feel that we like to use here at Motion Array. Stylizing your text is way less about knowing which buttons to press and way more about knowing a particular outcome that's going to look desirable. There's a lot of different ways that you could go about this, but one common solution that we like here at Motion Array is to take what we learned from our last video and add a shape layer to your text. Let's just try this out. Take your rectangle tool, shortcut key Q, and let's make sure that none of your layers are highlighted. Now, when we make our shape, it makes a new shape layer instead of a mask. Stretch it out so that it covers the text. Now, this doesn't exactly look the best and we can't even read our text, but if we bring our shape layer down so that it's below our text layer, we can see that it has its own backdrop to clearly stand out against. Awesome! Let's change the color now. Lastly, let's take what we learned from video 2 and let's pre-compose our text and shape layers into one layer. Highlight both of them and then right-click, and go to Pre-compose. And let's choose to move all attributes into the new composition. And there we go, now our text and the background shape can be controlled as a single unit. But guys, that's the basics of working with text in After Effects. I hope you found this video really helpful. In the next video, we're going to be going over how to use effects and plugins in After Effects. Thanks so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. So we mentioned in video 1 that there was a panel here called Effects and Presets. If you're familiar at all with Premiere Pro, this is basically exactly the same as the effects panel in Premiere. If we select it, we can see that there's a huge selection of different effects that we can actually add to our video. This list is much larger than the one available inside of Premiere and contains very powerful and highly specialized effects. But it would be impossible to go over all of them, so we're just going to go over a couple of principles and then a couple specific examples. Effects in After Effects work on a drag and drop system. So let's see how it works with a simple Gaussian blur. Let's find it first by going through the folders. And we can find this particular effect under the folder called Blur and Sharpen. You can probably tell that each of these different folders holds a specific genre of effects, and you can easily tell what kind of effects are going to be in each folder. But if we know the name of the effect that we want ahead of time, or even just part of the name, we can type it in here on the search bar, and only effects whose names partially match will pop up. Now that we've found our effect, when we drag and drop it onto our layer here, we can notice two things. First is that under our layer drop down here, we get an additional tab called Effects. And if we drop it down, we can see that our Gaussian blur is located here and that we can make changes to it. But we can also see that when we dropped it in, it brought up a new window in place of our project window. This is our Effects Controls window, which has a similar function to the one in Premiere Pro. Here we have the option of making our changes to our video layer from either of these two locations. And when we make changes in one of these locations, the change is recognized in the other one as well. If you ever need to go back to your project window to find video files, you can do that by clicking this tab up here. Great! So now we can see that if we increase the value of this effect, the effect becomes stronger and more prominent. And if we look at all of the different options that are available to us for this effect, we can get an understanding of how many different things we can actually do with this specific effect. For example, in addition to making our image more or less blurry, we can check this box to make sure that all the changes extend to the edge of the frame. But it's important to note that effects will only make an impact on the specific layer that you apply them to. So, for example, we have our layer here that we applied the blur to. But now let's say we add a mask to this layer, like we learned how to do in video 4. And then we add another piece of footage beneath our layer here. Now we can see the blur is only impacting the clip that we added it to. If we wanted to make the blur impact both pieces of footage, you have two options. You can either add the same blur effect with the same parameters to the second piece of footage, and an easy way to go about doing that would be to highlight the effect, copy it, and paste it to the second video layer. But a much easier and simpler solution would be to use what's called an adjustment layer. To add an adjustment layer, simply go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Now you have a new layer called an adjustment layer. But what does an adjustment layer do? Well, in oversimplified terms, an adjustment layer is a layer that you can make changes to, and when you make changes to it, it applies those changes to whatever is underneath it. So now let's get rid of the current blur effect by highlighting the effect and hitting either the delete or backstroke key. Great, and now let's add the blur to the adjustment layer itself. Now we can see that our entire image has been blurred out as a single unit. Nice. One of the best parts of adding effects is how they can all work together towards a common goal. So, for example, right now we have a scene that's entirely blurry, which you might think is a little bit silly and has no purpose. But there's actually a couple cases where that would actually be helpful and visually appealing. One of those is when you want to make text stand out even clearer. So let's add in a new piece of text like we learned how to do in video 5. And now that our text is in place, you can see that our attention is drawn completely to the text. But it's still a little bit tough to read our text really easily. So I'm just gonna add in a new effect called Hue and Saturation, and then I'm gonna drop the lightness down a little bit so that all of our background is darker and the text stands out a little bit more. And if we try to drop our text layer beneath our adjustment layer, we can see that our text is blurred out too, and has the same darkening effect that we just applied. But for now, let's just bring it back above our adjustment layer. What's interesting is that even though our text layer isn't technically a video layer, we can still add effects to it. So I'm gonna search here for a specific effect called Light Sweep. And I'm gonna add it to our text layer on top here. We can see that the effect makes a line across the top of our text. And we can also see some of the parameters that can help us control how it looks. Like, for example, the intensity of the light, as well as the angle that it's shining across our text, and even the position where it's located. And when we change the position, you'll notice that it's only shining a light across the text and not the video, giving it a really cool effect. But you might also notice something else, that when we move the position of the light sweep, it actually looks like light is really sweeping across your text. And you can actually animate it so it appears this way in your scene. Just use the keyframe stopwatch and animate it like we did to the motion of our video in part 3 of this course. Hit the stopwatch to set your starting position, then move forward and set your ending position. And keep in mind that when you're working with keyframes, it's always best to use the effects panel underneath your layer on your timeline. And this is our final result. Now we have a scene with multiple effects coming together to make something happen. We've just gone over 2 of the absolutely countless number of effects that you can actually use in this program. So I would suggest going through the list and trying out any that catch your attention. Just playing around inside of After Effects is actually one of the best ways to get comfortable using this program. And guys, that's just been a basic overview of how to use effects in After Effects. I hope you found it helpful. In our next video, we're going to be going over how to use scripts and expressions. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. You've made it all the way to video 7 of this After Effects course, so congratulations! You're nearly at the end and you've already learned so much, enough to start getting really comfortable using After Effects on your own. To start off this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to work with null objects and how to parent layers to them. So to start off with, what is a null object? Well, basically a null object is an invisible layer that has all of the same properties as a visible layer, but just doesn't cause any visual distraction. To create one, go up to Layer, New, Null Object. And you can see now that a new layer appears on our timeline, and our viewer shows a small square here in the center. This square is your null object. But why would this be useful? Well, let's create a situation and see one way that it might be used. Let's create a shape like we did in video 4, and I'm going to create a triangle. And now our composition has our null object as well as our triangle shape layer. And now if we wanted to animate this triangle to enter in off screen from the left, we already learned how to do that, and we can do so by animating the triangle's position properties. But you can also do it by using the null's properties. First thing that we're going to do is called parenting. Parenting is basically telling After Effects that we want one layer to follow exactly what the parent layer is doing, like a child following their parent. To parent a layer to your null object, we're going to go to our triangle layer here, and we're going to hold this spiral here and drag this line called a pick whip. And then we're going to release the pick whip over the null object layer. And now we can see here that underneath the parent section, our box here says null because our triangle is parented to our null. Now, if we animate this null to come in from the left, we can see that our shape also follows in exactly the same way. Pretty neat, right? And if you change any of the null's properties, the triangle will follow in a similar way. You can change position, scale, and rotation. But the question still remains, why wouldn't you just animate the triangle layer itself? Well, let's just change up the situation slightly. Let's say now that we don't just have one shape, we have 3. And we want all of them to move identically. It would be pretty difficult and time-consuming to do that all by animating each one individually. But it's way faster and easier to do just a simple pick whip, or select the parent from this drop-down here for each of our 2 remaining shape layers. And now when we play back, all of the shapes follow the same path. And we didn't have to put any extra work in. We just piggybacked off of the one animation that we already created. As you begin to progress out of the beginner stages of After Effects, you'll start to see that as your projects get more complex, it saves you a lot of time and energy to be able to create easy, simple shortcuts for yourself. And using null objects is a great tool for this. And the last benefit that we want to cover for null objects is that even though it keeps the movement identical for every layer that's parented together, it still allows for each individual layer to retain its own unique characteristics on top of that. So, for example, we have our shapes here coming into frame, and they all stick together. But if after they come into frame, we wanted the triangle alone to break off from the group afterwards, it can do that. Just animate that triangle layer on its own instead of the null, and the null will respect that layer's ability to move on its own at the same time. So now the end result is that you have everything moving together, and then you also have the ability for things to move in isolation. I really hope that helps you to have a better understanding of how to use null layers and why they can actually be really useful. But I think it's important to point out that you don't just have to parent things to null objects. You can actually parent any one layer to another layer by the same method that we used before. So let's say, for example, that you have two clips on screen at the same time, and you want to animate both of them so that they move onto screen. You only have to animate one of them to follow this action, and then you can parent that second one to follow. Great! Just keep in mind though, the starting point of where you parent these clips together is important. So, for example, if we parent our clips together while they're in this final position, they'll act completely in uniform. But let's say now that my playhead is positioned here midway through the movement, our parenting would keep this relationship between our clips so that if we move forward, we can see that our layer moves with our parented clip, but from the starting point that we gave it. Just to keep in mind that as you work with parenting, that your playhead position can make a difference. So we've covered null objects and parenting, and we're about to look at previewing your videos in After Effects. But quickly before we do that, it's also important to note that we've worked with a variety of effects and parameters throughout this course already. And you've noticed that we've animated a lot of different attributes. As long as an effect, attribute, or anything can be manipulated and has a stopwatch beside it, that parameter can be animated to change over time. You might be surprised of all the different things that you can actually animate. And you might also be surprised at the ways that you can cause things to be animated. There's one last method that we're quickly going to introduce you to in order to manipulate your layers, but it's pretty advanced, so we're just going to show you that it's there and then let you delve into it more when you feel comfortable. Within After Effects, you don't always have to tell your clips exactly how to behave. You can actually give them boundaries to follow and then tell them to work within that on their own. The way you would implement this is with what's called expressions. Expressions are basically the ability to type in commands into specific parameters to achieve a result for your clip. To get to the expressions capabilities, go to your dropdown for Transform and choose the parameter that you want to work with. For us, I'm just going to choose Position. Now hover over the animation stopwatch and hold Alt and then click. Now you should see another line drop down, and on the right underneath your layer box, you should see a set of text that you can edit. This part might get a little overwhelming, so we're just going to quickly go over a simple example and then link to another video if you want to check that out in more detail later. With this text here highlighted, we're just going to type in a new expression. Wiggle, bracket, 5, comma, 40, close bracket. And now when we click off of the clip and play, we can see that we've told our attributes to wiggle around as if the camera they were being filmed from is shaking. If you want to go more into detail with this effect, we have a whole video that we did just for it, and you can find a link to it in the description below. But hopefully, with that example, I hope you're able to see just how much you're able to do inside of After Effects. It's a really powerful program. But the more that you do with this program, and the more effects and layers and pieces of footage and shapes that you build, the more it will start to bog down your computer. And you'll start to notice that your playback won't be running at full speed. So how do you actually view your project back at full speed if it's running slow? Well, let's go here to our preview panel and see what we can do. Up here, you should be able to see a few different buttons at the top. These are our navigation buttons for the timeline if you don't want to grab the playhead. You can go to the first frame, one frame previous, you can play and pause, you can go one frame forward, and then lastly, you can go to the very final frame. And you can also play and pause your playback with the spacebar, or choose a different shortcut key to use instead from this window here. And you should be able to notice that when you hit spacebar, your playback will start. But depending on your project and the power of your computer, it might not play back in real time. You might also notice that when you look at your timeline, you might see one of three things. Either a green line, a blue line, or no line over certain parts of your timeline. Wherever there's a green line, it means that your footage has been cached to the RAM of your computer. This is the best and fastest solution. Next, blue means that that portion has been cached to your computer's disk drive. Not quite as good, but still far better than the last option, nothing, which means that your footage there has not been cached at all. In order to experience a proper playback at full speed, your project will need to be fully cached for whatever you want to actually view. And the way that you initiate this is by hitting the spacebar and to begin the preview. What After Effects will try to do is run through and cache your project on the fly as fast as it can. If you have a good enough computer and a light enough project, you might be able to experience a full playback on the first pass-through. But likely what'll happen is that you'll have to wait for it to do one full pass-through of your timeline, and then on the second playthrough, it'll be more or less full speed. For our example, it's pretty light and we don't need to wait long. But if we have a larger project, like this one here for example, we can see that it will actually take a lot longer for it to pass through before we can even start to view in real time. So how can we optimize this so that we can have the best experience possible and maybe not even have to wait as long? To start with, ask yourself, do you want to see all of the work that you've done on the timeline or just a specific section? If you want to see everything, you can have the entire duration selected under range, or just to have work area selected and then make sure your in and out markers have the entire timeline selected. But if you just want a section of it to view, you can place your playhead at the starting point that you want and hit B. Then go to the ending point that you want and hit N. This will give you a new highlighted work area. And then if you have the work area option selected here, your computer will only focus on caching and playing back that specific area. Next, you can choose here if you want the preview to start from where your playhead is positioned when you hit spacebar, or if you want it to start all the way back from the beginning on its own once you hit the spacebar. Next, there's these three boxes which will each impact how much work After Effects has to do in playing back your clip. Obviously, if you had the choice, you'd want to see it in the best and fullest settings. But in case you can't wait for that, or you want or need to see it faster, you can do a couple of things. You can drop the playback frame rate below what the composition is set up for. So even though our composition is set for almost 30 frames per second, we can drop our playback to 15 frames per second. And our playback will look choppier, but it will be ready and play back much more readily. I'm just gonna set it back to auto for now. Next, you can skip sequential frames so that After Effects doesn't have to render every single frame individually. If you skip one frame at a time, it'll drop every other frame. And you can also tell it to skip 2 or even 5 frames at a time in order to really boost the playback performance. It really won't look the same, but you can really use this to get a broad picture of what your project is looking like much faster. And finally, the resolution here is identical to the resolution tab of the viewer that we looked at earlier in this course. Dropping the resolution of the playback will make After Effects show a lower fidelity picture of each frame, but it'll be able to process everything at a lot faster of a rate. And finally, you can check full screen if every time you hit the spacebar, you want to see your composition played back at full screen on your computer. To get out of this full screen playback, just hit the spacebar again to pause. Knowing what each different parameter controls can help you to optimize your own playback for whatever situation you find yourself in. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to probably do at least a little bit of waiting if your project is larger. And guys, that's it for this video. You've already learned so much in this After Effects course, and you're almost at the end. The last thing we have to do is go over how to render out and export your video into its own unique file. And that's all coming up in the next and final video. I can't wait to see you there. Guys, congratulations! If you've made it this far into the course, you've learned the basics of how to work with videos in After Effects. But now you need to actually export your work so that you can send it off to be integrated into a larger video project or just to stand alone as it is. We're going to be going over two different methods of integration, just straight up exporting and also adding an After Effects file itself to a Premiere Pro project. So let's get into it. First off, you might notice that this project is a lot more complex than the previous ones we've been going over. This is because I'm going to be using a couple of specific examples as we go through this video. To render out your After Effects project, you need to identify your project and how long it lasts. Whatever composition you find yourself currently in, that's the composition that you would export if you began the process. So, for example, if we dove into one of our pre-comps, we would only be able to see this if we exported it from here. We actually want to go back into our topmost composition so that our entire project is being accounted for. If you know which composition was your starting one, then you can just select it and go from there. But if you can't quite remember, you can always remember to bring up the flowchart here by clicking either this button here or the tab button. Like we went over previously, from here you can see a left to right flowchart of all the different compositions in your project. And you can easily find the topmost composition just by going all the way over to the left. Click it and it'll take you right there. Now that you have the correct composition, you need to set a start and end time for your composition. If you don't, then it'll simply render out your entire work area. This might work for you, but there's also a really high chance that you'll only use a portion of the composition that you have. Rendering out the whole thing will give you unnecessary footage or leave a big dead space at the end. Depending on your export settings, this can add unnecessary time and disk space to your computer, so it's best to avoid it if possible. Bring your playhead to the start of the composition where you want your video to start. To set the endpoint, hit the B key. You can think of B as in beginning. Then go to the endpoint where you want your video to end and hit the N key. You can think of N for end, I guess. Great, now let's go over actually how to render. To get to your render settings, simply go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. Or you can simply get there by having your timeline highlighted and then hit Ctrl or Command M. From here you should have your render queue pop up and you can set the parameters for how you want your render to actually be carried out. Where I like to start is by simply hitting the blue name beside the output option, and this will allow you to choose a name and location for you to export to. Name it something that will tell you in an instant what video file you're actually working with, to distinguish it from other video files. Also, I would suggest creating a folder within the project that you're going to be adding it to so that you don't have to search through your entire computer to find it. Next up, let's go to render settings. This can totally be a matter of preference and just what your specific project needs. But if you're just beginning, we're going to run over some quick settings that will most likely be what you need. Make sure that quality is set up to best and that resolution is set to full. Unless you're using proxies, which you're probably not because we didn't go over it in this course, keep it at no proxies. Have effects and solo switches set to the current settings, and make sure that all guides are set to off. And keep color depth at the current settings. Next, for time sampling, keep frame blending for check layers, field render off, motion blur for checked layers, and time span work area only. Use the composition frame rate that's been set, but if for some reason you know the specific frame rate you want and it's different from the project, then this is where you'd change that. But I would suggest if that's the case, it's best to have that done at the beginning of your project. Hit OK, and we've got one less block of settings. Here in Output module, don't worry about color management, we're just going to go over your main options. Format, I would choose QuickTime, but as you can see, there's a lot of different options. If you have a specific need for your project, feel free to research what would work best for your particular situation, but QuickTime is always a safe bet. Now let's go into more detail with formats. Go down to Format options here, and under Video Codec, and we can see again, like we had a lot of format options, we also have a lot of codec options for that format. Each codec is a particular program that compresses the data of your video in a slightly different way. There's a bunch of different options, and again, depending on your needs, you can research and see what would work best for your project needs. But again, a safe bet is always animation. This is what's called a lossless codec. So once it's selected, you can hit OK to go back. Keep post-render action at none. Have included project links checked. For video output, have channels set to RGB, but if there's any parts of your project composition that are transparent, showing this checked box pattern in the background, then if you want it to actually end up being transparent, you'll need to make sure that alpha channel is also checked. If you don't, then when you export, it'll automatically fill in the transparency with a solid color, either black or white, depending on how your composition is set up. So to make sure that transparency is kept, you would choose under Channels, RGB plus Alpha. Keep depth at millions of colors, and color at pre-multiplied, matted. Try not to resize or crop unless absolutely necessary, and unless you have a firm understanding of what you're doing. And as for audio, chances are it won't be vital to your project, as you'll probably be adding it back in a different nonlinear editor. But for now, just to be safe, keep it at default settings. And guys, that's it. Now, when you hit render, you can see the progression and its estimated output along this line here. And when it's finished, it'll be available where you originally specified for it to be sent to. And that's how you export in After Effects. But there's also another way of getting your project to where it needs to go that might be a little bit more attractive and flexible. If you're using Premiere Pro to compile your video and just using After Effects for one piece or one scene of it, you can actually let Premiere and After Effects talk to each other with what's called Dynamic Link. The first thing that you quickly want to note is the name of the composition that you have at the topmost part of your project. Basically, the main composition that every other composition sits inside of. You'll want to know this because you'll have to pull it up by name later on. Again, if you can't seem to find where it is, hit the tab button and look for the far leftmost composition. Next, open up Premiere and then find the After Effects project file on your computer. Now, you're just going to drag and drop it right into your Premiere Pro project window. And you should see that a new tab pops up. It's going to ask you for the composition that you want to import. And this is where you need to select the specific one. Because you looked it up earlier, you know what it is. So choose that composition, and now the final result is that your After Effects project is sitting right inside of your Premiere Pro project. If you drag and drop it into your Premiere Pro project, it'll require some rendering to play properly, but the great benefit of doing it this way is that if you end up going back and making any changes later on in After Effects, you won't have to re-export your video again. Adobe's dynamic linking system will automatically recognize that it's been changed, and After Effects will update your Premiere Pro project version to match. It's just that easy. So now you've officially integrated your After Effects project into your larger video. And when you find yourself doing another project in Premiere Pro, keep in mind that you can do the same process really quickly in reverse. You can take a video clip that you're working on in Premiere, or highlight a selection of clips, and then right-click and go to Replace with After Effects Composition. This will send your selection from Premiere Pro so that you can work on it inside of After Effects. Guys, I hope this video has been helpful, and I hope that this entire course has been able to teach you more about how to work effectively inside of After Effects. If you guys like this video, or the entire course, feel free to share it with a fellow video editor friend. And as you keep learning and growing in After Effects, we'd highly